Morning. So we want to talk about how we are all Federalists, we are all Republicans. Or that's what Thomas Jefferson said in 1800 after he was elected. This was the first time political parties had changed hands. And it was very significant because there was no blood in the streets, and it actually went really well. So, some things about Jefferson: he didn't really mess with things that were working. For instance, he didn't mess with the bank. He didn't mess with the debt policies that had been put in place by Hamilton. He didn't mess with neutrality policies. He carried those on. He did reduce the size of the military. He reduced the number of federal jobs. His most significant contribution is in 1803. He's going to bend his constitutional interpretation on the purchase of Louisiana from the French. You see, Napoleon had obtained it from the Spanish. It had belonged to the Spanish as well as Spanish Florida. The Haitian slave revolt, though, is going to catch attention because Napoleon realizes that kind of is going to shred his ideas of setting an empire in the US. Napoleon wanted to concentrate on Europe. And so Monroe is sent over under Jefferson to offer 10 million for New Orleans and hopefully more. However, when he's met there, they said, "Hey, you want that entire Louisiana territory? We'll give it to you for 15 million." And it was a deal that was pretty hard to pass up. This is another thing that's very significant is going to be the Lewis and Clark expedition. The Lewis and Clark expedition was the first federally funded scientific expedition. They were sent to look at things from the Louisiana Purchase, and what they gained new geographic and scientific knowledge that we previously did not have. They actually developed better relations with the Indians. That didn't help them in the long run for sure, and better maps. So let's talk about changes to the Supreme Court. There were a lot of last minute appointments by John Adams to the federal judiciary system to the point that they're called the Midnight Justices. John Marshall, however, is going to be one of those, and he is going to hold the position for 34 years. He was actually a cousin of Thomas Jefferson, but that does not mean that they do well with each other during their time together. The most famous case that is going to kind of get the Supreme Court up and running is going to be Marbury versus Madison. Now, if you remember, it's a very complicated case that has to do with a gentleman who wanted to be the justice of the peace for the federal city, Washington, D.C. But what really matters is in this case, Marshall and the Supreme Court established judicial review, which means the Supreme Court can look at other decisions and use that check and balance that's been given to them. Let's talk about the reelection in 1804. Jefferson was surrounded with a lot of things, including the Burr conspiracy, the Hamilton shooting. And with this, he ends up getting reelected. He is going to end up making Madison his vice president. Around the same time, he is facing some international troubles with the ruler of Tripoli, who demands a tribute, or he will unleash the Barbary pirates. And so, what is going to happen with this had previously been paid by other presidents, but Jefferson says no. And so, this is going to cause our Navy to grow substantially. We're also going to have problems with Britain and France, who are currently at war with impressing our ships. This means they seize them. One specific incident is when they attempt to seize a ship called the Chesapeake. It ends up being known as the Chesapeake and the Leopard Affair. This takes place in 1807. It angers Jefferson so much, he petitions Congress and they pass the Embargo Act as an alternative to war. It is going to be an unpopular act. It is bad for merchant marines and particularly New England. It basically almost kills their economy. And so he is going to repeal this, or Congress is going to repeal this in 1809, shortly before he leaves office. Jefferson upholds the two-term tradition and was not very happy with himself when he left the White House. Madison, however, is going to follow, Jefferson and Madison and Monroe and many like them are all going to follow this lead of Washington, the two-term tradition, although they don't listen about political parties or foreign entanglements. But hey, let's stick to that two-term. The act that is going to repeal the Embargo Act is going to be the Non-Intercourse Act. It's going to say we can trade with everybody, but not Britain and France because they're the troublemakers. That's going to be replaced with Macon's Bill number 2. And this basically said whatever nation would jump in first, we would negotiate with and trade with them exclusively and not the other between Britain and France. And we wanted it to be Britain, but Napoleon's like, yeah, I'll bite. Not you, Napoleon, but then you can't go back. And so he doesn't really hold to his word, but still, we've already kind of made that agreement. So let's talk about how this leads to the War of 1812. We're tired of not having freedom of the seas and trade. We begin to feel frontier pressure with the Native Americans that we believe are being stirred up by Britain. That is Tecumseh and his Red Stick Confederation, which ends up in the death of his brother and that whole crazy curse. And so we desire territories like Canada and Florida. And so the Warhawks in Congress, these young men by the name of Clay and Calhoun, are going to really push and demand war. And so, despite the fact we've asked Britain to stop impressing our ships, which is part of their orders of council, we eventually decide, you know what, let's do it. Let's declare war. And so, the irony is the US declares war, and just days later, the same time, Britain rescinds the orders of council. And so, if we would have waited a little bit, we would have got that and been like, oh, okay, we don't have to go to war. America is very unhappy. We are very disjointed in this war. New England particularly hates it because their economy is barely recovering from everything that's just happened anyway. And so we try this invasion of Canada, which is a big fail. The naval battles are pretty unsuccessful, except for the one with Old Ironsides, the USS Constitution, which was a ship that was made out of petrified wood. The Chesapeake campaign, basically in the spring of 1814, Napoleon was defeated, and so the British come in and they march through DC, and they are blowing and going, they are destroying. However, we do have some success at Fort McHenry. It's here that Sir Francis Scott Key is going to write the Star Spangled Banner. The Southern campaign is going to be a little less successful for the British. This is where you have Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson is going to take on the Red State Confederacy at a place in Alabama called Horseshoe Bend, and basically ends up at New Orleans on January 8th, 1815. Ironically, about 2 weeks after the war is over. So the Treaty of Ghent is what we call status quo antebellum. It doesn't really change anything, but it ends the war. And so that's its purpose. One other thing we want to mention before we leave off here is that during the war, there was a group that met in New England called the Hartford Convention. And the Hartford Convention met for the purpose to discuss secession. New England actually talked about leaving the United States at this time because they were so tired of their economy being infected by these stupid embargo acts and by these trade regulations. And so, shortly after they're finishing up these treaty demands, they're coming to DC, they're going to present them, and they get there and they're like, why is everybody celebrating? They're like, the war's over. And they're like, oh, never mind. All right, guys, see you next time. Bye.